Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is the incredibly popular Pentax ME Super. It was launched in 1979 and was in production until 1984. And to my mind, it gives a clue as to the ambition and direction of travel manufacturers were wanting to go in at this period. Remember, if it was launched in 1979, the design for it would have been made much earlier in the 70s. But let's take a look at the top plate controls, because they're a little bit unusual. We have no shutter speed dial, and yet we have other very traditional controls like a mechanical frame counter, a manual wind on lever, exposure compensation dial and so forth. So before we put some batteries in here, unusually I want to take this off the lock position to any other position. This is auto, and even without batteries in, the shutter still fires. People buying cameras at this sort of period would have been used to cameras from the earlier 70s and even 60s, which would have been mostly mechanical. And there was a certain amount of trepidation among consumers to buy a camera that was entirely dependent on using batteries. Obviously over the years that concern dissipated over time. But nonetheless, having a mechanical backup shutter speed of 125th of a second did play well to the galleries of people that were concerned about not having a battery dependent camera. Now we can set 125th synchronization speed and it will work perfectly well at that as well, and certainly if we're using flash we should be using that setting. Worth noting, 125th of a second is pretty fast for a camera of this period, and that relates to the shutter in the camera, which we'll look at in more detail shortly. There is a second mechanical mode on this, which is the bulb time. You press the button and the shutter will stay open until you release it again, but in this camera it is mechanical, so it's not wearing down the batteries whilst it's got the shutter open. So that's pretty cool. So that being said, let's move this back to the lock position and pop some batteries in. So it's a fairly standard arrangement. I'm going to use a 20p coin here because the flat edges do lend themselves quite nicely to battery compartments. Although this one is putting up a bit of a fight. So it runs on two 10L14 batteries, also known as A76 or D357 or LR44s, lots of different names for the same thing. Positive terminal goes inside the camera, and you might be able to see on the inside of the battery cap is a little negative symbol indicating the negative terminal should go upwards. So just close that down. Again, putting up a bit of a fight here. And just while we're looking at the base plate, I'm going to mention these mechanical contacts here and this cover here. If you are using a winder and it uses the winder ME or ME2, you'll remove this cover and it will connect via those electrical connections. Lastly, on the base plate we have the rewind release button just here, which is perfectly standard or common. So let's go and take a look at the controls now we have batteries in here. Top plate, apart from the interesting, I suppose you would call it a command dial, it's not a shutter speed dial. So this is really a camera that's looking towards the 1980s, which as we all know was the best decade, and looking at the features we came to know and love in terms of LCD displays, push button control, built-in winders, and it's trying to look towards that type of specification but with a 1970s technology base. But we can just move the control dial to auto, and then we'll just choose an aperture, and focus of course, and the camera will choose a complementary shutter speed. We choose a smaller aperture, we get a longer shutter speed, And if you choose a wider aperture, we get a shorter shutter speed. Very, very simple. Now the ME Super was of course an upgrade or an update to the original ME, and the major difference over the ME is the addition of a manual exposure mode. Now whilst I very much enjoyed this camera, and I think it's one of the cutest SLR cameras that's ever been made, it's not perfect. So if we were in manual, the shutter speed is displayed in the viewfinder. We'll take a look at the viewfinder display in a moment. There is no indication on the top plate what shutter speed we have set manually. If I press the shutter now, I simply don't know what speed the camera is going to work at. We appear to have set something like a 4-second shutter speed. The shutter speed range, by the way, is 4 seconds to 1/2000th of a second. And again, 1/2000th of a second, pretty swift by the standards of the day. To set a shutter speed, we press these up and down keys. So if I hammer on this up key, we'll get a faster speed. There we go, but still no indication on the top plate what that is. But just whilst we're here, I'm going to point out this little red dot. As we fire the shutter, it disappears, and as we wind on, it reappears. So there's a visual indication when the shutter's cocked and ready to go. Not the most useful thing, but there we go. We've covered the flash sync speed and the bulb mode, so let's pop it back into auto and have a look at the only other control dial on the top plate. Lift and twist to set the ISO. The ISO range, or as it would have been at this time, the ASA range, is from 16, in fact I think it's from 12. Yeah, 12 to 1600, that's where the 16 comes in. So quite a decent range. There's a lot of interesting slow speed films on the market these days. So if you wanted to use something like this Adox CMS20, which is nominally 20 ISO, you can do that in your Pentax ME Super quite happily. Now if you wanted to use a faster film, and bear in mind in 1979 there wasn't a 1600 ISO film, so having 1600 ISO on the dial, or ASA, was future-proofing it to a certain degree. But today, if you wanted to use something like Delta 3200 and rate it at 3200, you could set your ASA to 1600 and use the exposure compensation dial to reduce that exposure by 1 stop, effectively making it 3200. On the subject of the exposure compensation dial, most cameras that feature one of these will say +1, +2, -1, -2, and they'll often have half or even third of an increment steps. Pentax went their own way and went with a multiplier of a half or a multiplier of a quarter, or on the other side, twice or 4 times the exposure. This does cause a little bit of confusion in some cases, but this is basically 1 stop under exposure, 2 stops under exposure, and then 1 stop over, 2 stops over. You might, if you have an ME Super, want to get a little bit of paper and write minus on one side and plus on the other, just as a little aide de memoire. Why Pentax did it that way, I have no idea. So let's have a look at the other controls on this camera, which are fairly few and far between. I'm just going to pop it on the 125th setting for convenience. We have a self timer. It's clockwork. You wind it down, you tap it up, and then you wait a few seconds for the shutter to fire. There we go. Underneath this cover here, I don't know how easy that is to come out, there we go. That's what we used to call a PC socket, a flash synchronization socket. This also comes into play if you have the Databack M. So the Databack M would print the date on your photographs. That was a proper 1970s looking device. Sadly I don't have one, but it essentially has selector wheels on the back, and you dial the date and the year in. It's not like it has a quartz display like the other ones, but it synchronises with a cable from the film back to the PC socket, so actually had to plug a cable in order to print the date on your photographs. We have a little window here with an orange marker on, and we'll take a closer look at that when we load a film in. So let's go ahead and take a look inside. So I mentioned you could put a data back on here. There's a little pin to remove the existing back. I'm not going to do that, it's a little bit fiddly to put in. Obviously for this period there's no DX coding pins. You have to remember to set the ISO based on what's written on your roll of film. This is 200, you would set that to 200. Film loading, I'm not going to show you the way the instruction book shows you. I've shown it in other videos. You put the film in here, you pull it out. I'm going to do it in my own way. Now this was known as a magic needle take-up spool. So instead of having a single slot or 3 or 4 slots, it's got multiple slots. Now some people, rather unfairly I feel, call that a tragic needle system, but I always found it to be quite user-friendly and very reliable. Now when we look at this little window here with the orange markers in, as I wind on, you'll see it oscillates or moves from side to side. That is confirming the film is moving through the camera. One of the biggest problems with 35mm cameras is a tendency to load the film incorrectly. There's a little memo holder here. You can tear the end off the film box and put it in there if you wish. So removing the film, standard sort of a thing. Press the rewind release button, open the lever, and just wind in the direction of the arrow until resistance disappears. And actually, there we go. And there's our film. The shutter itself is a vertically travel metal bladed shutter, and that's why we can get that 2,000th of a second shutter speed. With a traditional cloth shutter, where the cloth or the edge of the blade has to go from here to here, there's a limit to how fast that can happen. Because we're going vertically, it's a shorter distance of travel, so it simply takes less time to travel that distance, and that's how we get that 2,000th of a second. I think it's quite a nice shutter noise, quite soft, and the shutter itself was actually, I believe, made by Seiko. Changing the film, or changing the lens, I beg your pardon. Press the lens release button, turn, remove, putting the lens back on again. You find the red dot on the lens, you find the red dot on the camera, and line them up. While we're here though, we can just see the lever that would operate the aperture working there. I did actually make a video about mounting PK lenses on cameras. There is a little extra feature. You might want to go and check out that video if you want to see the secret way of lining the lens up. It makes life a little bit easier. And that is basically it for the ME Super. It's very, very compact. It was very popular. When it was new with a standard lens, it cost £130, which was quite a lot of money in 1979, but it was certainly at the lower end of the price range for a 35mm SLR. These days on eBay, for a nice one, probably about £100 still. I was fortunate to get this. It was being sold as spares or repairs, and there was a certain amount of gunk underneath the selector dial here, so sometimes it didn't work so well moving between auto and manual. We should actually, I did say we would take a look at the viewfinder display, so let's take a look at that now. So we can see there is a light on the left hand side, and if we're in the automatic mode, as we change the aperture, that light goes up and down, and it lines up with the shutter speed the camera thinks is appropriate for that aperture. That's very simple. If we move the exposure compensation dial, we'll see that as we increase the exposure, the shutter speed drops off, and as we reduce the exposure, the shutter speed increases. So if there's a lot of sky in a landscape and you don't want the landscape to be silhouetted, you might want to increase the exposure by 1 or 2 stops. Likewise, if somebody's wearing a wedding dress or you're out skiing, you might want to increase the exposure above the indicated level. If there's a group of people all wearing dark clothes, then you might want to reduce the exposure slightly, go the other way. So when we go into manual, the display now tells us, and this is the only place on the camera that it does tell us this, what shutter speed we have manually set. There's an under marker at the bottom of the scale and an over at the top of the scale. If you're underexposed, it will flash a red light next to under. If you're overexposed, guess what? It will flash a light next to the over button, or the over marker. Your ambition using it in manual should be to make the 2 red lights disappear. Once they're gone, you're good to go. This camera really is intended to be used in automatic mode. Remember, this is an ME with manual bolted onto it, so the manual mode isn't especially user friendly, and if all you're going to do is set the manual exposure based on what the camera recommends, well then you might as well use it in auto. If you want to override that exposure, well, you have exposure compensation, which does a pretty good job. There are times when manual is invaluable, but for most people, most of the time, this is a camera probably best used in aperture priority. Which rather brings us on to a question of, should you buy one of these cameras? And as much as I like it, if you are wishing to learn about photography, I would probably say there are other choices. Either go for one of the very inexpensive fully manual cameras, Casino and Vivitar are brands that come to mind, or even a later 600 series Canon EOS or a camera of that nature. Although they are very automated in many ways, quite often in manual exposure mode, the manual exposure meter is much easier to read in the more modern cameras that have LED and LCD graduated markings. But if you're coming to film photography, perhaps you've got a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you're wanting to try film, or you had Pentax cameras in the past and you like the size and the feel of them, then an ME Super is certainly a great choice. Now, normally with an SLR camera, or a 35mm SLR camera, I wouldn't bother taking any photographs, because quite frankly, the photographs from one SLR camera are going to look pretty much the same as any other. But because when I got this out of the box, I bought this on eBay, I was enamoured of how compact and how cute it was. I did take a few photographs with it, so let's take a look at some now. This first image is basically leaves with a church behind it. One thing using an SLR camera over a compact or an automatic camera is the ability to control the depth of field, and as we see, the background's blown out here. These are not the most exciting photographs in the world, but moving on. Little church window. Interesting, this is Portra 160 film. It's a relatively expensive film, but we can see a great exposure range with it, and we can actually see detail in the darker areas of the images, and we can even see some detail in the clouds in the sky, which are otherwise completely blown out. So good film in a good camera. This is the church clock tower. Again, fantastic level of detail. This 50mm 1.7 lens is a super little lens, and of course, being a PK camera, being a Pentax mount camera, there's plenty of lenses to choose from. Here's a church bench, or a bench in the churchyard. Again, we've got a control of depth of field, which we wouldn't necessarily get with a point and shoot camera. And with this being such a small camera, It is almost a point and shoot in its own right. Pentax made a 40mm pancake lens. They were quite expensive when they were new, and they're still quite expensive, but if you can get one on a camera like an ME or an ME Super or an MG, it's a super compact way of getting an SLR camera. I had this film in the camera for quite some time, I'm afraid, so we've moved forward from summer to December. We've gone to Woollerton Village, a leafy suburb of Nottingham, and the famous Admiral Rodney pub. Again, we can see a high level of sharpness. This next image, the Christmas at Woollerton illuminated sign, not the best example of what I was trying to show here, but when you look at the background, the fairy lights in the background, they are pretty circular. There's a nice bokeh in that image, and as we move on, we can see on this picture of the rosemary, because we're using an SLR and not a compact, we can frame the picture much more accurately, and the bokeh is quite nice, quite smooth in the background there. And lastly, another picture of some rosemary on a frosty day, and again we can see a smooth level of bokeh and a good level of detail and sharpness. So that's been the Pentax ME Super. It's a lovely little camera. I would recommend you try one if you want a film camera, unless you are looking for your first camera of any kind to learn photography. The manual mode on this, we have to remember, was sort of shoehorned into an automatic camera rather than being part of the original ME design. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I do hope somebody has found this video either of interest or use. All the best.